Good evening. I'm Devin Kimball. I'm the general manager of the American Club. I just had my first anniversary on Tuesday, and I think I've been eating cake ever since. I'm happy everyone could join us for the second run of the series of Walking Down Memory Lane with Jim Baker. I certainly spot some familiar faces from the previous talk. This series is part of our year-long celebration of the American Club's 70th anniversary. Our speaker, Jim, is no stranger to our community in Singapore, having lived in Singapore for most of his life. Jim studied at the American School for a decade between '56 and '66. He's a Singapore American School legend. He was a teacher, mentor, and coach at the school for 35 years before retiring in 2014. In fact, I think he probably would still be there if he hadn't retired. He'd just gone on forever. He's the author of 4 books on diverse topics that cover Singapore and the United States. The American Journey in Singapore, Singapore's Eagles, Crossroads, A Popular History of Malaysia and Singapore, and The Eagle and the Lion City. The last 2 titles are available at the club library. And adding to his portfolio, Jim is also the appointed historian for the American Club and is working on our 70th anniversary commemorative book. I would highly recommend his books. They're accessible and wonderful reads on the history of Singapore, and I've enjoyed them very much. As a longtime member of the club, Jim has witnessed the transformation over the years and meeting challenges of change and growth, especially in this recent couple of years during the club's major undertaking of the redevelopment project, as many of you have as well with patient understanding. Note that there will be a question and answer session after Jim's talk, but because this is a school night, it would be great if you could keep your questions brief. Now, let us enjoy a walk down memory lane with Jim as he brings us on a mesmerizing journey of the club's history and his fond memories of growing up in Singapore.
As Devin said, I'm working on a history of the American Club right now. And as historians, we like to divide up history into eras and so we can make generalizations about it. And this is not the way the book is divided up. But for tonight's talk, this is the way I decided to divide up the history of the American Club. Because I would maintain that there have actually been 4 American clubs. The 5th one is being built right now. And each one reflects the club, the American community, the neighborhood around it, and the country around it. And so I decided to break this, when I talk about 4 different clubs, I put some iconic pictures of Singapore during these eras. So for each one, if you would talk what's iconic about Singapore, the harborfront, then HDB Flats, Changi Airport, and today it's a casino, but anyway. And just to begin with, I was able to get a hold of 2 pictures of basically the same area. This is 1955, just before the club was built on Scotts Road. And then this is taken from the Ministry of Environment building in the 1990s. So that is where that building would come down, and that's where the club would be, today's club. So let's begin at the beginning, which is the American Club in the Cathay building. There are very few pictures of the American Club in the Cathay building. That's the York Hotel on Scotts Road that I'll get back to. But this, it was on the top floor of the Cathay building. It was a bar and a billiard room. And then this veranda. The people said, the best view in Singapore. If you want to have a drink and see Singapore, the Cathay building was the tallest building in Singapore, and it had the best view in Singapore. A business, it started really by people who were here before the war. If you go and look at who actually served on the committee and who the driving forces, they were people who had come back after the Allied victory. And in many ways, it was a businessman's town club. The main shopping area, business area, was the Rabbits Place area, High Street, that area. And so it was very convenient to where people worked and where people shopped. This picture, I'm showing it because originally you had a men's business club, but it was actually much more than that. And there were, I know one woman who used to call it a poker club, because one of the activities was guys get together and play poker. There's actually a poker game that began at the Cathay Hotel, moved to Scotts Road, and lasted until 1968, when the last two of the original game retired. So a 20-year poker, so in that sense she was right. But the woman that I was talking to, the other, in fact, that's her right there. She explained to me it was much more than that. And that the people who it meant the most to were the American women in Singapore. And if you look at the records, the women held fashion shows there like this. They played mahjong and they played bridge. And it was very easy to make it look very shallow and like idle, affluent people sitting around playing cards. But it was much more than that for them. In those days, the average tour was between 3 and 5 years. So when you left the States to go to Singapore, depending on who you worked for, if you worked for a company, most companies it was 3 years before you got home leave. Missionaries, 5 years. And an airmail letter to the States took 10 days to 2 weeks. It went by sea, it took a month. There were 2 flights to America a week on Tuesdays and Saturdays. And literally, you could check your mailboxes on Wednesday and Monday because you knew those were the days the mail came from America. There were no schools, and so your kids went away to boarding school. It was a community without teenagers. By age 11 or 12, kids went away to boarding school. The American school opened when I was in the 2nd grade. 1st grade, I spent in missionary boarding school. They lived in large homes. These were middle-class women who moved to Singapore from the States, and suddenly they were house managers. They had a gardener, a driver, a cook, and an ama. And they were multiracial. And you spoke to them in kind of a pidgin Malay called Mem Malay. And I can remember talking to her about that. And she said how much she looked forward to the AWA, American Women's Auxiliary meetings, because she felt so isolated, cut off from her family, cut off from her children. Her husband had a job, right? And went on and did what he would have done anywhere. And so sometimes we forget that these women found a way to come together and to meet each other. And she said she used to look forward every week to playing mahjong. And when I was younger, I thought that's really ridiculous, you know. But in actual fact, it was a very big deal for those women. And I end the first part in 1956. The club actually moved in 1955. The reason is in 1956 the club changed. In 55 it moved physically, okay? So here's, this road here is the road in front of the Goodwood Park. That's the Tango Club. This is now Far East Shopping Center. This is the building that came down for the American Club. This is Scotts Road here. There are no pictures of this club. I have no idea why. Nobody took pictures. But then you say Singapore has no attics. So where would you find this? This was the original, the artist rendition of the original club. It was one story, and where I'm pointing here, there was a bowling alley there. The tennis court wasn't built because it's actually 3 levels, the club is. And it was a figment of somebody's imagination because it looked good to have a tennis court there, which eventually became a swimming pool. But reason 56, because 1956 is when the American School opened. American School opened in Tanglewood on Washley Drive. And it changed the community, and it changed the club. It changed people's lives dramatically. Because it was more than just a school. Suddenly you had a community that had teenagers in it. And it went deeper than that, because at that time, Singapore was a garrison city. There were 50,000 British troops here. They were fighting a war in Malaya. There was the Cold War. And so much of the social life in Singapore was directed at those 50,000 troops. There was some social life in the hotel, but for teenagers, there were the clubs. But most clubs were for whites only. The tango club, the golf club, the swimming club, the cricket club. These kids went to a school that was multiracial. The American club was multiracial. And so it became the center of their social lives. They could socialize with their peers, no matter what nationality they were, at the American club. And if you're old enough, you remember when the DAP took power in 1959, they banned jukeboxes, pool tables, and pinball machines. Well, if you're a teenager at that time, that was part of your social environment. The club had them. So they got this American place that had American food and those things that had been denied in the larger community. And for a period of probably 30 to 35 years, the American Club would be the center of life for American adolescents. It begins to change in the 90s and changes even more when the school moves to Woodlands. That's another story. So, 56, now the club has teenagers. Years later, they would be sorry they had them, especially in the 70s. But I thought I'd show this. This is CK Tang's, the first locally owned department store in Singapore. And this here is Orchard Road, 1967. That's the International Building. 2 things here. One is...
Sorry, what building is it?
Pardon?
International building.
Yeah, that's the International Building. There. But it was shop houses, mainly up and down Orchard Road. And it flooded. If you had a high tide and a hard rain, this happened. It was always kind of interesting to me. Was it 2014 we had really bad floods in Singapore? Singapore government spent $2 billion making sure Orchard Road wouldn't flood again. Well, don't mess with Mother Nature, right? Climate change or wild whatever brought the floods back. But literally, when I was in high school, we had flood days. Kids in the States had snow days. We had flood days. Anyway, that's kind of, and the neighborhood, this is the corner of Orchard Road and Scotts Road, 1967. Tanglewood Police Station, CK Tang's, and his Patrick's. Yeah. 1958, Singapore's first supermarket, Fitzpatrick's. And over here is the first new hotel to arrive on Orchard Road. That was the Intercontinental. Today this is the Forum Galleria. Then it was the Intercontinental Hotel. Everybody thought they were building HDB flats. Kind of looks like it, right? Another interesting thing about this is see that? How much higher it is than the road? The road now is up here. Anyway, during this time, as the community grew, the club grew, and you would see the first redevelopment of the club. I showed you the picture of the original building. The first was the building of a bowling alley. This building here was basically a bowling center. And this was a breezeway that went from that to the Claymore building. But in the first redevelopment, they took that and turned it into a coffee shop. And so this is that. And it was really quite, you would enter the club from Scotts Road. If you were going up to the main building, you went through the coffee shop. If you parked on the other end and went to the bowling alley, you went through the coffee shop. Jim Ellis, who served on the American Club Committee in the early 80s, mentioned this. He talked about how when you went to the club, you walked through the coffee shop and saw everybody you knew. And he talked about the sociability of the club. And it still exists, but you walk through that coffee shop and you'd see people and say hello, and it was actually a different atmosphere as a result. But we're talking about the Manhattan Room, which was the main, whoops. Okay. And when they redeveloped the club the first time, the first part of it was building an 8-lane bowling alley. People forget that in the 1960s, 1 out of every 3 members of the club participated in a bowling league, in an organized bowling league. 1 out of every 3. In the 70s and 80s, over 500 members belonged to organized bowling leagues. So bowling was an important part of the club, as was the Manhattan Room. On Friday nights and Saturday nights, especially Saturday nights, the place was full. Saturday nights they would have a band. Friday nights they had a kids' movie, so parents would go into the Manhattan Room, put their kids in the movie. And Friday and Saturday nights, many of the associate members called the Manhattan Room on Saturday night Yankee Stadium. But they would have a band, and dancing, and friends, and drinks, and it was very well used, and was a central part of people's social life. Because there wasn't what you have outside the club, what you have today. So this is after the first redevelopment. This was the old bowling alley. The gabled part of this became what was known as the presidential room. And you can see there's still a driveway that went from from Scotts Road to Claymore. And there was, down here were community offices, American associations, newspapers. And the driveway was lined with travelers' palms. And the travelers' palms along the driveway were iconic American Club. The school yearbook put those palms on the cover of the yearbook at least 3 different times. In that same redevelopment, we got the men's bar. So in 1971, they redeveloped the club, fixed up the Manhattan Room, they had put in a new bowling alley, they had built a new pool, they had built a new coffee shop, the first redevelopment of the club, and built what was called the men's bar. The papers had fun with this one. Local papers were saying, so here's the home of feminism. And at their club, they had a men's bar. And it was called the men's bar for some time. Later it was called the main bar, but people still called it the men's bar for probably about a decade. Well, this redevelopment was meant to accommodate a club of about 2,000 members. When it was redeveloped in 71, there were about 1,000 members. So they figured, okay, 2,000 members maximum for the redevelopment, and then it's going to have to be redeveloped again. And so by 1978, 1979, there were over 2,600 members. So it was bursting at the seams. So people started talking about, what are we going to do? Some ideas were to buy new land and that kind of thing. But the first proposal to redevelop, this was the first proposal. People looked at this and said, how are you going to do that on this piece of land? And it was a good question. This is some pipe dream of some architect. And it was going to cost about $50 million. And they were going to have to tear down the whole thing. So while they rebuilt it, there was not going to be any revenue. And people, it was a sticker shock. The proposal lasted about 3 months before the people running the club realized that it was a bad idea, nobody wanted to do it, forget it. Well, the club continued to grow, and it would peak in 1983. And so to accommodate the growing membership, it went back to its roots and opened what was called the Town Club. That's Tulloch Iron Market there, or La Mansard. 18th floor, Cecil Street. I mean, it actually gone back to, full circle back to what it originally was. The difference was, and then over on Scotts Road, first they were going to build a 3-story parking lot, and it got vetoed by the government. So then they built a tennis court on top of a parking lot. The problem was, they didn't lay the court right, and then the building itself wasn't approved by building control, and so they had this tennis court parking lot nobody could use. Well, but the Downtown Club, they signed a 6-year lease, spent a fortune out of the capital account fixing it up. It was beautiful. But in 1982, 1983, America went into a recession. 1985, 1986, 1987, Singapore's real GDP fell for 3 years. And the membership, the number of ordinary members at the club went from 1,200 to 500. It would be the second time in the history of the club where there were more associate members than ordinary members, even though the charter said it had to be 51%. But if Americans left town, you couldn't just throw people out of the club. And so in 1965, the same thing had happened before. During the war between Malaysia and Indonesia, the American community stagnated, and for about 6 months, there were more associate members than ordinary members. But then things picked up, Singapore became independent. But this was something else. 1,200 to 500 ordinary members. There were 100 more associate members than there were ordinary members. There's 2 ways you can look at that. One is the associate members saved the club. The other is that how are we going to pay for this stuff? They had signed a 6-year lease at $30,000 a month. They had fewer members than used to work in Raffles Place area. The membership fell. They were running massive deficits. They were, in a much smaller club, they were running deficits of over $100,000 a month. Their overdraft was over $1 million. So obviously, any new hopes of redeveloping the club were going to have some problems. And it's an interesting time in the history of the club because it was very controversial. Membership was down, they were running a deficit, nobody and they had spent the wad on the town club. But their buildings were aging. They'd been built in 71 and before. They said that the presidential room had the best prime rib in Singapore, but don't go when it rained. Because literally, it had a leaky roof. And the coffee shop was built as a temporary thing, and this was now 15 years later, and its roof leaked. So the club itself was getting shouted, run down. So what do? Very few banks in Singapore wanted to lend the club any money because they had a piece of land, but if they didn't meet their obligations, were you going to foreclose on the American community? No bank in Singapore wanted to go there. They did eventually get financing from 2 Malaysian banks and a French bank, and God only knows where they found it. Kind of like Trump financing, but anyway. And they had a committee, so they were facing these tremendous financial constraints. Membership was way down. But the problem was not just the American recession. And the people on the committee at the time realized that. Because by 1986, American enrollment in the American school was rising, which tells you the community was growing again. And yet, the club's membership kept falling. So they figured they had to redevelop the club. Haywood Blakemore, who was the president at the time in 1985-86, said, our choice was rebuild or die, because other clubs were offering better facilities, and the American community was changing dramatically because Singapore's economy was changing. You had new people coming in with new companies who had no connection to the club. So how are you going to get these people? And for a period of about 2 years, the politics at the club were brutal. Club committees always complained they could never get anybody to do an AGM. And literally, sometimes they would run up into the bar and grab guys because they couldn't get a quorum. And they'd go, come with us. All you have to do is walk in, sign, and you come back to the bar. And please, don't stay. And they faced a dilemma. But they had, in 1985, an AGM where half the ordinary members actually voted, which I don't think has ever been touched before. And it was a shouting match. Because you had people who liked the club just the way it was and didn't want the prices to rise. You had other people who wanted to move the club. If we're going to do this, let's move out to someplace and put in a golf course or whatever. And then you had associate members who couldn't vote, so they were, no taxation without representation. Anyway, and it really turned into a battle royal. And at the 85 AGM, they decided to go ahead with this club here, which was 3 floors up, 2 floors down, and keep the Scotts Road building for a restaurant, bowling alley, and there's one other thing you needed to keep there at that time in the club's history, which were the slot machine rooms. And once again, a good case can be made that it was really the associate members who saved the club, because that's when the transferable membership was introduced. And it was designed to make sure that when people got their transferable membership, they couldn't sell it for 5 years. So associate members could become transferable members, which meant that they now had an asset. Their membership became an asset. And they structured it in such a way that they had a revenue stream for 5 years, which also made them look better on paper to anybody that was going to be hopefully someday lending them money. And so they embarked on this American Club here that is finished in 1989. But it was very controversial. And like the people who moved the club from the Cathay to Scotts Road in 1955, if you look at the times the club was redeveloped, every one of them was at a time in Singapore's history it was very, if you could say, in 55, 56, there were riots in the streets. In 66, when they began to redevelop again, it just been at war with Indonesia, and Singapore just became independent. And then in 89, it just come out of the recession, the membership was way down. How are we going to do this? And there were a lot of cynics that had seen the tennis courts go up and they had seen things, and they just didn't believe, we don't believe you guys for anything. Within a year, they discovered it wasn't the change in the American community that was messing things up. It was the facility, because within 2 years of building a new facility, the club had reached its former peak in 1983. By 1998, it reached its historical peak of about 4,200 members. And a good case can be made. One was the Singapore economy, no doubt, came back, and the American community grew. But the facility itself was an inviting facility and made it possible to reach out to a new community of Americans who came in. Transferable memberships and the slot machines. It's amazing if you go back and look at the records of the American Club at the revenue they got from slot machines. The first slot machine was introduced in 1948 at the Cathay Building. American President Wise went to some NCO club in the Philippines, went in and bought 2 used slot machines, sent them to Singapore, and they were put in the original club. As time went on, they realized that this was a gold mine, literally speaking. And so by the late 60s, they were bringing in about $1.5 million a year from the slot machines. By the mid-70s, that had risen to about $3 million. By the late 70s, half of the club's revenue was coming from the slot machines. And during the '85 recession, when the club was in trouble, one of the ways they increased their revenue was to allow people, members, to bring guests who could play the slot machine. Because prior to that, guests couldn't play the slot machines because members get all mad. You're taking my machine. So then, okay, gamblers can bring in gamblers, and it increased. The revenue from slot machines at the American Club finally peaked in like 2007 at $13 million a year. It's just amazing. And most of those people in the slot machines were Singaporeans. So between the slot machines and the transferable memberships, you can make a very good case that the Singaporeans saved the American Club at that time. So nice new, and the new slot machine room in this building was great. But things were changing. And at this time, the bowling alley, the slot machines, the Manhattan room, these were the key parts of the club, the centers of the clubs. But change was coming. First of all, the American school moved to Woodlands. And besides that, the neighborhood changed too. You had the Intercontinental, then you had a Hyatt, then you had a Holiday Inn, then you had Hilton. Anyway, all these hotels in this part of town. And the shopping area of Singapore moved down Orchard Road to where the club was. When the club was built in 1955, it was the first new construction on Scotts Road in 30 years. So it was 2 rows of very big houses that rich people lived in 55. But then Fitzpatrick's, C.K. Tang's, Cold Storage became a supermarket, the hotels moved in, and suddenly this end of Orchard Road had life to it. And it created a reassessment of what's the role of the club in this community. The community was growing. One of the things that had saved the club in the 70s, and they kind of missed it, was the oil boom. Where in the 1970s you saw, in 1969, the American community had about 1,500 people. 10 years later, it had 8,000. And a whole bunch of those were people who worked in the oil industry. And for the first time in its history, the American community had blue-collar people in their community. And it had a definite Southern accent. And Stan Sesser, who was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker for years, wrote an article on Singapore called A Nation of Contradictions. And he's talking about Singapore at this time, where you had the so-called battle against hippie culture. And so that's when long hair, people with long hair will be served last. Areas that had rock and roll music were shut down because they wanted to avoid the terrible influences of the West. And in the 70s, it probably was pretty smart thing to do. But at the same time, because this is one of my memory I have very stuck in my mind. So they banned certain songs, certain music, including one, Puff the Magic Dragon, go figure that one. You banned Peter, Paul, and Mary. But, so, songs that had drug-related themes and explicit sex. Well, Orchard Road at the time, at this end of Orchard Road, had Genevieve's, which was also a live music place. It was a honky-tonk bar, basically. And we had live music at the Shangri-La, which was country and western music. Across the street with the Rialto Towers, we had Chico's and Charlie's, which Katie we all had. The Shaw House was mainly oil service companies. Gold Hill was mainly oil service companies. The Petroleum Club was at the Goodwood Park Hotel. And so, but anyway, the story is, I'm in a record store on Orchard Road, and they would sell you the songs that were banned from underneath the table. Down, it was like a drug deal. And I was in this record store with a friend, and in those days, you remember record stores where you put a record on and have them play a song for you if you're old enough to remember that, or you remember vinyl. So I'm in this with a friend of mine, and at the time, this Judy Buffett had a song out called "Why Don't We Get Drunk and Screwed?" Yeah. Right? Remember that song? Great song. So I'm there negotiating with this guy for a song under the table, and he puts on this record for my friend. And you can see his eyes. Why do we get drunk and screwed? And he's kind of going, what? But you had this strange situation where there was a campaign against Western culture, but not Southern Western culture, right? So Southern Western culture was okay. Why don't we get drunk and screwed is okay. But the Rolling Stones, let's spend the night together, not okay. And if you listen to the lyrics of both, I'll tell you which one's misogynistic and the other one, well, it's just Mick Jagger. But anyway. So, the school moves to Woodlands. And the island changes. And for teenagers, suddenly there's lots of things to do in Singapore. Right? Lots of things. And so, by the 1990s and into the 21st century, the club ceases to be the center of the American adolescent community life. Second thing that happened. All those bowlers that I was talking about who came in the 60s and 70s were getting old and didn't want to bowl anymore. I mean, it was true. Sometimes in the 70s, there were 8 lanes there every night of the week. Leagues, all 8 lanes, fully booked. Saturday morning, Friday morning, Wednesday morning. There was something like 9 leagues going on, and a bar that fueled all of them. And so, the popularity of bowling in Singapore, and an aging membership at the club, and changing tastes in the States. In the 50s, when bowling came to Singapore, was when America suburbanized. And bowling went into suburbia. And so it came with those people but bowling in America was losing popularity. Bowling in Singapore was losing popularity, and the bowlers were aging. So the bowling alley ceased to be. And then you got things like cruises to nowhere, which was called a floating casino. You know, where people would get on ships in Singapore, they'd sail out someplace and play the slot machines and gamble. And then also at the same time, you had people were talking about building casinos in Singapore. So the slot machine revenue peaked in like 2007 at the club, and then it begins to taper off. And the gamblers, you could go to the cruise, you could go to the casino, and so that revenue from the slot machines began to taper off, and the number of people using the slot machines began to taper off. So the teens weren't that interested in the club anymore. The gamblers found greener pastures, and bowling was beginning to die. So the club needed a new model, because if you take those three activities, it was a big deal for the club. And when this club was built in '89, it's around that time that they begin to realize we've got to come up with a better way to pay our bills than we have depended on previously. And that's how you get, first of all, they reach out to a company called Club Corps to come in and run the club. And it wasn't that great an experience for the club. And there's a good reason for that. Because to bring in outside management lost sight of the fact of why the club was successful. And that was the relationship between its staff and its members. And nobody coming in from the States could ever understand that unless they were here for a while and got to know what that was all about. So in the early 21st century, a new business model is put forward. The idea is, where do we get revenue? And that's where this idea of all under one roof came from. Things like the time and essentials. I mean, the closet. I mean, they put in conveniences, but also were revenue streams. How many bottles of wine did you tell me the other day you sell?
We sell a lot. I mean, we did one the other day, it was like 168 for one customer.
Right. So people could get their laundry. They could get their laundry done.
$450 a lot.
They could get their laundry done. They could go. They could shop in a convenience store. They could go to Tide, which had pastries and wine and stuff like that. It also had a coffee shop along the hallway over here. The new pool meant new activities for younger kids, like swimming lessons and that kind of thing. But the idea that you created a situation where people would come to the club and do lots of things there, and you had to create these new revenue streams. And it was quite, the interesting thing was that by 2001, when this idea was instituted, they reached the holy grail of club management, when they balanced the operational budget. And it had been a rare thing up until that point in time. It had been balanced in the 60s and maybe once in the 80s or something. But that under one roof concept, right, was successful. And Josie, who was the general manager at the time, that was kind of her idea. And she was a marketing person. And that was kind of her legacy of the club, was this idea that you don't have to depend on slot machines and those traditional things that we used to have. So that then is a new club, right? This new club that was built in '89 was a different breed of cat than the club had been for most of its history. And the Super Bowl at the club got popular enough that they used the presidential room, what was it called? It was called the colonial room, which was the function room, and the bar when they had the Super Bowl, because it was just falling all over the place. And the new Eagle's Nest, which began as, basically took over the ground floor. It was like amoeba. It kept growing and growing and growing. And between the Union Bar, the Eagle's Nest became the two most important revenue providers, as well as these new retail outlets that the club was now providing. This one here, this picture here I have up here. This is Beth Gribben and Jim Gribben. They were husband and wife, obviously, and they're both presidents of the club. I don't think there's well, I know. It's only those two. There would have been one husband-wife group that were both presidents of the club. And Beth joined 3 other people in the history of the American community who, while they were here, were president of the club at some time and chairman of the school board during their time here. Paul Boardwell and Larry Wales in the 50s, Beth Gribben and Haywood Blakemore. So in the time they were in Singapore, held those 2 positions. That's community service. Anybody who served on the committee of either place when you were going through change, right? And change is like Singapore's, if Singapore had a middle name, it would be change. And you constantly lived in this cycle of change, and you had to provide leadership. This here is Martin and Patricia. And this is a VIP dinner because at this time the club also recognized that it had members who had been here for 25 and more years. Most of them obviously were Singaporeans because not that many Americans at that time lived in Singapore for 25 years. And so they created a new title of membership called VIP. Later on, other categories were added, like if you give us your firstborn child, we will give you a discount. Yeah. Anyway, and over here is one issue that has faced the club throughout its history. This is the 2004 presidential election, and it was organized by the American Association and the American Club. And they brought in 2 people from Republicans abroad and Democrats abroad for a community debate. This is 2004, 2008, 2012. Because one question that the club faced for most of its history was, is it a club or a community center? And when it was first built, it was a community center. Kathy Tan, who's here, who actually was at the Cafe Club, remembers the Christmas parties. The Christmas parties at the club are open to every American kid in the community. Many people say that's where the American school came from. Because in 1954, and let's remember, every kid over the age of 11 was away on boarding school. You couldn't come home for Christmas either, because you didn't have enough time. And there were 110 kids there for a Christmas. It's the baby boom time, right? 110 kids, and the moms the next day got together and said, we want a school. And it was that American Club party that gave them the evidence to go to the men in the community and say, enough. We don't want to send our kids away to boarding school anymore. We want our kids here. We're Americans, we're not Brits. And so, through the history of the club, because the club was actually started by the American Association. Until '56, it was run as a subcommittee of the association. It had no legal standing whatsoever. It bought land with no legal standing. But that was anyway, another era. But that question has been posed many times. What is the relationship between the American club and the American community? Today, there's probably about, the American Embassy says there's 27,000 Americans in Singapore. The club has, what, about 3,500 members, give or take some. Well, that's a big difference. In the 1960s, a majority of the Americans belonged to the club. And in the 1970s, still a sizable portion of the American community belonged to the club. Even during the OPATS years, the Petroleum Club had lots of members, but people with families wanted to put their kids in the American Club because that's where their friends hung out. That's where activities that they were interested in were. And that question, I'm sure, continues to face the club. What is it? What is the club? Because there's not one American community anymore. There are many American communities in Singapore. There's a community in Woodlands, there's a community in Sembawang, a community by the river, a community on Orchard Road. You can go on and on. And it is a challenge the club faces. And until recently, all the major community organizations had offices in the club. When they redeveloped the club in '71 and when they redeveloped the club in '89, both times they made sure that there were spaces there for the community organizations, the association, the EWA, the newspaper, these kinds of organizations. But anyway, that's just to say that's a dilemma that has faced the club for a long time. Point being that this is a community event. Election watch. Is a community event. When the club lets everybody come in on election day and cry. Flag blues at 9 o'clock in the morning, get drunk. It's going to be a long 4 years. But that has been constant. But each of these 4 clubs represents a different Singapore, a different community, and a different neighborhood. That's why I say there's 4 clubs. I have no idea what happens to the 5th one. Because, well, I don't know. And I have no opinions about it either. So anyway, 4 clubs. In the book, that's not the way it's broken out. But anyway, I broke it up differently in the book. If and when you get the book, you'll see why. And I'm not getting paid for it, each book, so I'm not selling books. So anyway, 4 clubs. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
I think, excuse me, you said there were 27,000 Americans in
Singapore.
In Singapore.
That's what the embassy says.
yeah, and you said there were around 3,500 members, plus or minus. The actual answer is there are only 17, half of that which are American, and the other half are associate members.
Yeah, right.
So I think it's even a smaller percentage. So I think the question I have for you is, historically, how does a small 1,700 person versus 2,700 really represent a American club? Because that is clearly what the club is supposed to be, an American club. And there's the other side question, which is the Canadian inclusion of the North American flavor of this club, which is a different historical question, because is it Canadian, is it American, is it North American, where does North America start, etc. So I think my question again is very simple. It is 1,700 members is a small, really small number of 27,000. So how do we project the Americanness of this club going forward?
Can I just, there's 3.2 members, 3.2 people per membership. So there's about 5,500 Americans in the club. So
That's a fair point.
just as.
Actually, they used to count it by families.
Yeah, so
A
the
long time, that's how they
No, I think that's fair, but the number of people is
it's a lot less, but it's still
Still,
it's
yeah,
pretty
not
significant.
Yep.
North Americans. But they did the same thing at the school too. And I would say there are 2 or 3 reasons why that was put in there. One was, you have to remember that the people who built these institutions were World War II veterans. In 1971, when they finished the 71 redevelopment, Glenn Wood, who was the president at the time, is the last of that generation, the World War II generation. So these guys were veterans. And they had positive feelings towards the Canadians because they had fought together during the war. Didn't feel that way about the Brits, but anyway. That's a whole other. So there was a sentimental thing there, I think, as part of it. Also, it was a numbers game too, because you had to have X number of members to make it a going concern, and also when it was begun, it had to be 50% plus 1 Americans or North Americans. And if you go back to the early years, you only had 150 members when they started, so the numbers game was a lot different then. But I think that another thing I would say would be that those North Americans are part of our club community and always have been part of our club community. And as a history teacher, historian, I have, there's some things in the past that are positive and maybe we should honor. And we have a close relationship with Canada. And it was started as the American Club, but by North Americans. But one final thing I'd say, in 2007, they, once again, were talking about, shall we move the club? And for the first time, they had an overwhelming percentage that said no. And I suspect it's because the American Club has become an Orchard Road, that area kind of club. 87% in 2007 said don't even consider it. Whereas every time they talked about it before, it was very controversial. Where some people said, let's move. We get better facilities, cheaper land. But by 2007, that had changed. And 87% of the members said, we want to stay here. So there is, in today's Singapore, there is, I think, kind of an Orchard Road, Tainton, Holland, Mugitima nexus there. There.
What's the relationship been like with Tanglin Cup over the years? There's been any rumours about land being owned by us. And,
Well, actually, the land between the Tanglin Club and the American Club has always been the Tanglin Club's land. And as the club grew in the 70s, the club bought the Swiss Club, but the Singapore government wouldn't okay it, and so they had to move away from that. So they approached the Tanglin Club, and when they said to the Tanglin Club, let's redevelop that land together, put tennis courts on it, and make it into a sports center. And there were tennis courts there already. And there was actually discussion about it. But oil and water. The culture of the Tanglin Club was so different than the culture of the American Club. Every time they sat down to talk about it, they would end up walking out of the room like Kim and Trump or something. They just, they pull their hair out, and you hear them come into the bar at the American Club, damn Brits. And so, but they tried. But I've heard people tell me that it was American Club land. I heard people tell me it was half. No, it was always the Tanglin Club's land. I mean, Tanglin Club was here first. It's been here a long time. But yeah, they tried. But they offered the Tanglin Club to use our bowling alleys. And they said, why would we? So, say that. And they use our bar. Is it our bar's cheaper? It's better. I'm serious. The American Club bar is more expensive than 10 Club bars. So why would we go use your bar and pay more for the booze that we consume? And you can eat our restaurants. We're British. We don't eat real food. Anyway.
Are you sorry you asked?
Well, that was back in the days when British cuisine was an oxymoron. You know? But that's before Britain got real immigration, right? Then they got good food. Yeah.
I'm just curious, I mean, maybe there's already been an answer to this, but when they were in the process of digging up the pool, there was another pool that was underneath the pool. So what was here previously? And was that?
Well, the problem is the club is built on 3 levels. And it's on the side of a hill. And at the top of the hill was the home of the Traw family, which owned Cycle and Carriage, the Mercedes people. Leot Towers was theirs. I mean, that was named after the patriarch of that family. So their house set up on a hill. There were 4 houses between here and Orchard Road, and 4 houses on the other side. These were these were very wealthy families. But it came down in 3 levels. That's why they couldn't build the tennis court, because it was prohibitive to level the land to put the tennis courts in. And when they built the original pool in 1963, it was this kidney-shaped pool that, to this very day, people wonder if they really had permission to do it. Because it was always kind of iffy, you know, show me the documents kind of thing, yeah. But then for a long time, the club was just slapped together. Because the original building that was finally torn down in '89, so you had a building that was built in 1959, under 1959 building control kinds of regulations that was used for 44 years. In '87, they actually, even before they built the new building, they had to shut down the Manhattan Room because it was so expensive to aircon. It was a big, high-ceiling building that had been built before aircon. And it had fans in it and stuff until they finally airconned it. Well, in the '70s, you know what happened to the price of electricity, right? With the oil price, it went through the ceiling. And eventually, half of their deficit was coming from air conditioning the Manhattan Room. And by shutting down the Manhattan Room and the town club, their deficit almost disappeared. So it was a practical thing. But the point being that it wasn't very well constructed. One of the guys who helped build it, Bob Hauser, was in Singapore for the 50th anniversary. And he told me, he admitted, look, we didn't have much money. We were just trying to get things going and put things together, and we cut a lot of corners, you know, but it was all we could do because we needed to do it and get it going. And at the time we did it, 55, there were riots in the streets, and it was kind of an issue. They took a while.
So was that originally part of the development of the American Club, or was that from a previous house then?
No, the Scotts Road facility was built in '55. The pool was built in '62, '63.
The original, the one that they found?
The original pool at the club, yeah.
Okay, and then they just filled it in over the years.
Quick.
Well,
Because it was filled in.
they built a second pool, now there's a third pool. This is the third pool, I believe.
Yeah, but it was just filled in and there probably was no permission.
Nobody would have, I don't think anybody would admit that. In other words, if you're looking, because as a historian, you try to find archival evidence, right?
Right.
You're not going to find that.
Didn't exist. The pool didn't exist.
Something like that. The problem you have with community institutions, like the school and the club, I wrote a history of the school, and the first 5 years, the records are just incredible. It was a historian's dream. You're going, wow, wow. I didn't realize that. I was going to school there at the time. Wow, I didn't know that happened to him. Yeah. That's why she got fired? Anyway. And then they begin to give less detail as the school gets bigger and the budgets grow, less detail. To where in the 1980s, all you get from the board are bullet points. And the club's records are very similar to that, where the early years are pretty detailed. And then as the club grows and budgets grow and those kinds of things happen, it's hard to find detailed records. Now, I imagine if you went through the archives of building control in Singapore, and I wouldn't want to go there, but you might find the plans, but that would require great detective work.
And nobody remembers the
Who cares?
school. Nobody that they found at least.
Well, I remember the pool, because I was a teenager when it was built. And we used to hang out at the pool all the time.
So you remember that pool then?
I do, very well. We used to have all-night parties after the prom at the American Club. The club would let us do it. You know. The first American school graduation was held at the American Club. One student, her name was Louise Feng, and she couldn't walk into the Tango Club. There was in 1959. There were many places where she could not literally have walked into because she was Chinese. But she was the first graduate of the American school. They had the graduation in the Manhattan room at the club. As with the first prom, too, because it was a multiracial prom. Many of the hotels in Singapore at that time still chased people away who, like, if you were Chinese, some of the hotels I knew you get such bad service that you'd give up and walk away. They wouldn't say, you can't come in here, but you know, a half hour later as you're sitting there, you got the message. So, I don't know how you would ever find out about that. Is that the truth? It is one of those mysteries we'll never answer. Yeah.
As a historian, I'm just trying to understand, when do you find the cycles of archives, information, data, from a governance standpoint to kind of dig into this information? Is there a pattern?
In both, it's the 1980s. Because you have to remember that it's in the early 80s, the community peaks. Then there's the recession. And then after the recession of the 80s, the community booms again. And it's around that time that you find, I have some opinions about it, but I can't prove them. So, I mean, most of my opinions come from sitting around the bar. So, who knows? But things got a lot more complicated as time went on, as you have bigger numbers and you have bigger budgets. And, I mean, think about it. The capital fund. By the mid-90s, it had $35 million in it. 1998, the Asian economic crisis takes place. And there was a lot of discussion about that capital fund because it lost 25 to 30% of its value because of the Asian economic crisis. And there were people accusing the club of being thieves and putting money into their buddies' pet project, I mean, you know, those kinds of things. And then in 2008, the same thing happens again, where you had built the capital fund, and then comes the Great Recession of 2008, and bang, you get the capital. Well, in the 60s and 70s, nobody was worrying about investing in the capital fund. They were just hoping to have one, you know. And so, I think as it becomes more complicated, you get more subcommittees in the club, and you get less, I don't know what the right word to use is, but you get less detail about what's going on. And one of the interesting things is that if you study the history of the AGMs, historically, lots of club members complain about stuff, but not a lot of them go to AGMs. You know what I mean? And so, some of that probably was the fault of the member, and I understand why. It's a transient community. You're here for 2 years, What do you care what's going to happen 5 years from now? You know, it's true of the school, and it's true of the club, and it's understandable, right? Why should I pay higher prices now when 5 years from now I'm going to be back in San Francisco? And it's a problem of governance that's always affected the club, the school, SACAC, you know, those kinds of organizations. So I don't know how you ever solve that problem, you know, because when I began working on this book, I've been around the club a long time, but to find, okay, let's look at annual reports. You know where I got the annual reports from? I got them at the National Library, because the club was required to put annual reports in the National Archives. The club didn't have them until like 97 or something. Somehow they just disappeared in some move. And that's when I found those at the National Library. So overseas communities are not good record keepers. And that's a reality. Yeah. And for good reasons. I mean, for obvious reasons, not good reasons. I would think there are good reasons to keep good records. Yeah. As a historian.
You kind of started going down the road to this. You've been around for a long time. I'm a relatively new member. What is it in your mind that sustains a club like the American Club? How do we go forward?
I'm glad you asked that question. In writing this book, I've interviewed a number of people, mostly older members. And I talked to one who's actually a really old friend of mine, and we went to high school together here in Singapore. And I asked him, I said, how do you explain the club and what it is about the club? And that picture. Anyway, the picture of the bar with Beth and Jim Goodman. He said to me, the club is like the song from Cheers. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name and they're awfully glad you came. And it's not trite because it has to do with the relationship between the staff and the members. The club, as long as that bond remains, it doesn't matter what the club is or what happens. As long as there's that bond between, I mean, there is a guy that worked here for 50 years. His name was Gone, and the people here know him. He joined the club as an assistant barman, and when he finally left, he was an assistant manager. Great gentleman. But he epitomized the staff of the club. I mean, we've just been talking about this. 40% of our staff have worked at the club for more than 10 years. And if you look at the hospitality business, food and beverage hospitality business, you can't touch that anywhere in Singapore. I mean, and that says something. It says a lot of things. It says something about the relationship between the staff and management, the staff and members. Many of you may know Betty Coe. And I remember when I talked to her, she said that whether it was working on service things like caring for Cambodia, fitness programs, climbing a mountain in Nepal, she said that she always saw the members as her friends. Well, I'm not sure you can find that kind of attitude in a lot. If I go into Harris, they don't look at me as their friend, or you know what I mean. And that means something, and it's something that the club really needs to treasure. You know, that ability to maintain people who want to work here, who know your name. You know, so I think that the thing is that the American community has changed so much that the club has to find its way kind of thing. And that idea that 87% don't move, that says something about where your catchment is for members and stuff. And so, is it the Orchard Road American Club? or is it the Singapore American Club? You know, who knows what it will become as time goes on. But I would maintain, as long as they keep that relationship between staff and members, it doesn't matter. I mean, it might matter financially, but I think that that's what has carried the club throughout its history. That and leadership that's been willing to take risks at very unusual times, willing to take a risk to look to the future. And that has been true with the club as well. I mean, I never understood why anybody, in the mid-'80s, why anybody wanted to be on the American Club Committee. I have no idea. You were some kind of masochist, you know. You'd walk in the club and run. Because here are 8 people coming at you and yell at you. Yeah. I didn't build the building, you know. But there have always been people willing to do that. And that has been another strength of the club, is people who are just passing through town are willing to take their time, their effort, their reputations. They don't always make the right decisions, but they're willing to put it out there. And that's pretty unusual for such a transient community. I mean, at the school and the club, these two institutions are pointed to by the Singapore government as examples of community self-help. And for some reason, generationally, it has produced these kinds of people and results. That's a good thing. It's something that we should celebrate.
All right, well, I want to thank Jim tonight. You did a great job. I appreciate everybody coming. As I said, it is a school night, so we want to get you home before 9 o'clock. Otherwise, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin because, you know, tomorrow's Friday night. We're going to stay up a little bit later for that one. Thank you all so much for coming. Jim, are we going to have another one of these? Hopefully.
Well, I think the next month is, we want to talk about the trade winds.
Trade winds. Yeah, and some of how that the whole thing works into it. So one more hand, and we'll see you next week.